Floor is yours, Rachel.
Right, I just heard from Zala, so I just wanted to
No worries.
you know, she's going to join as soon as she's stuck in a work meeting as she's working from home. She'll join us very shortly. So I'll start the introduction, and then I'm delighted that you're here. My name is, I want to express, because I'm really impressed with the Jewish Family Services of Western Mass, and they're recognizing the need for extra attention to the resettlement of these newly arrived Afghans, and for organizing this series of presentations. And really appreciate you all setting aside the time to attend. Zala and I will be presenting. She will join a little bit later, so I will start with the introduction. And though we've put our presentation together, it represents both of our ideas. I will present the presentation because that's just the way she would prefer it. We both prefer it. Our approach to this presentation is to talk about Afghanistan, the country, the geography, the ethnicities, the religions in general, as well as the family structures, the gender dynamics, basic health and hygiene practices, and to focus very specifically on maternal health-related issues today. Our presentation is about 40 minutes, might be a little longer. You're welcome to put questions or comments in the chat. And of course, we'll have time at the end for a discussion. And again, we'll meet next week to even further follow up with a conversation. So I always like to apologize for offering very general introductions, because there are so many languages and cultures and religious practices, social and economic classes. It's hard to give an introduction without generalizing. And of course, what we say doesn't apply across the board. We also are very particular about the images that we use. Most of them are our own images, and we're aware that Afghans have many sensitivities with photographs, particularly of women. So we are using a few images by the Afghan photographer Fatima Husseini. And usually I have Zala introduce herself first, but since she's on her way here, I will start. My name is Rachel Lair, and my career has been formulated and colored by Afghanistan and its surroundings. I took up Persian, dialects of which are spoken in Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, as a college student, for no other reason than that it fit in my schedule, because that's how it is when you're 20. And I went on to pursue language and linguistics for my PhD. I studied in Iran before the revolution. I traveled in Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion, and I was awarded a Fulbright in Soviet Tajikistan. Ultimately, I wrote the first modern descriptive grammar of Pashai, a minority language spoken in rural parts of Eastern Afghanistan. So I've spent a great deal of time in the rural community in Eastern Afghanistan as an ethnographer, a linguist, and a part of the community. I helped community members start an NGO called Rubia, which was an income generation project for women with a focus on heritage embroidery. During the Obama civilian surge, mid-2000s, I guess, I also worked for USAID, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, to prepare their staff in Afghan culture before their deployments. Zala and I have also worked together on several grants conducting research on Afghan women's leadership and authority at multiple scales, from home to the national scale, with our colleague Jennifer Fleury at the University of Colorado Boulder. So as you can see, I have a very varied background, often with one foot in Afghanistan and the other in the US. It's that mix of experiences that I bring to this presentation today, and the fact that I've learned all my lessons the hard way. That is, I have made every possible intercultural mistake and offended people along the way, and mostly people were kind enough to guide me towards better words, better choices, and better behaviors. Much of my experience is in rural Afghanistan, because even when I wasn't in the countryside, the community of people that I spent a great deal of time with were rural folk, even in the city. So I bring a very rural perspective. And most of the people who are here, who've come from Afghanistan, are people from the countryside. So I think that's helpful. Zala will present much more of an urban and educated perspective on Afghanistan. So until Zala comes, I'll just proceed. And when she comes, we'll have her join and introduce herself. Because I'm a linguist, I like language, and I think it's great to know a little bit about the language or a few phrases in the language. And this is a kind of pan-Islamic greeting. It's not in the language of Afghanistan, but it's a greeting that you would say, Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. And people would respond by switching the two words and saying, wa alaikum assalam, and upon you peace. And just a few phrases go a very long way in Afghanistan or among Afghans, very highly appreciated. Afghanistan is a country that sits on the crossroads of major ancient cultures between East and West at the heart of the ancient Silk Road. Its location is more defined by where it is not than where it is. It's not the Middle East. It's not Central Asia. It's not really South Asia. It's kind of bits and pieces of all of that. Population is 37.5 million, and the capital city of Kabul is about 4.5 million at this point. It continues to confound its quote guests, invaders, occupiers. It's a place that people have a hard time understanding and learning about, and somewhat by design, I would say, on both ends. It's the home of Rumi the poet. It's the game of polo comes from Afghanistan, and the game of backgammon. It's often described as rough, rugged, and unconquerable, but it's also breathtakingly beautiful. The cultures of Afghanistan have been influenced over the years by Buddhist monks who traveled through from the east, and the raiding hordes of Turkic tribes from the north, and of course, the indigenous Indo-European and Indo-Aryan cultures, and naturally Islam, which has profoundly and repeatedly continued to transform Afghanistan. It's a landlocked country with scant water, and all the rivers flow through. So they come in from one side and flow out the other side. The Hindu Kush Mountains that you see quite prominently divide the country from northeast to southwest. There's a desert in the south and a steppe in the north. And many of the recent arrivals are from the southeastern part of the country. The Hindu Kush Mountains are considered the foothills to the Himalaya. The climate is arid, rarely below 20 degrees. In summer, it can be hot and humid in the east, while dry in Kabul because of the altitude of 6,000 feet. Afghanistan, the population that is more than 70% rural, and most people are subsistence farmers. Drought has been a persistent problem for years. There is far more arable land than there is water to cultivate. Water rights and land ownership are continuous sources of tension and conflict. There is a saying that Kabul can be without gold, but not without snow, meaning that snow bodes well for the upcoming agricultural season. Nevertheless, the Northeast winter is longer and harsher than what Afghans are accustomed to. Child labor is common in Afghanistan. In urban areas, children mainly work in mechanic shops or convenience stores or like little kiosks like this. In the rural areas, they do agricultural work. In general, children are tasked with many responsibilities at a young age. Even if they are not working, they are looking after their younger siblings, they're preparing food, gathering fuel, shopping alone, running errands, for example. So I'm going to give you a very quick bit about Afghan history. Afghanistan was never colonized by the British, though 3 wars were fought over their attempts. This continues to be a point of pride among Afghans. Afghanistan's borders were determined during the late 19th century, where Russian and British colonial powers, vying for territory, influence, wealth, and resources, battled what was known as the Great Game. Afghanistan was conquered by neither, but had its borders defined as a buffer zone between the 2 imperial powers. Political conflict in the 1970s led to the Soviet invasion in 1979, which drove over 3 million Afghan refugees into Pakistan and gave rise to numerous Mujahideen factions, bolstered in Pakistan and funded by the US. The US proxy war ended with the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, and the US interest in Afghanistan evaporated along with it. A civil war raged among the Mujahideen factions until 1996, when the Taliban movement rose in response. Their Islamic emirate came out of the Islamic schools, the madrasas, that were, quote, educating young Afghan boys in Pakistan. They put an end to the civil war, but created a pariah state and plunged the country deeper into poverty and isolation. This ostensibly ended with the US invasion in October 2001. So trauma has been a big part of Afghans' lives. The country's been in conflict for 45 years, and the impacts are present in all aspects of life, from loss of relatives to continuous displacement, disrupted social structures, and even executive function. Afghanistan is made up of numerous ethnicities, languages, tribal and non-tribally organized people. So the languages of Afghanistan have roots in Indo-European languages and Turkic languages and the Indo-Aryan languages of the subcontinent. So without putting too fine a point on it, just when you see the reason I like this map so much is that the colors show you that these language clusters also exist outside of Afghanistan. And it gives you a sense of the kind of pressures that can come to bear politically on Afghanistan. For instance, the largest ethnic group are and the politically dominant one are the Pashtuns. They're shown in green. You see that they're all over the country, but they're particularly found in the east in Pakistan. A large portion of Pakistan is also Pashtun. Pashtuns, as you might associate with the Taliban, but they have been the monarchs of Afghanistan and all the elected presidents. They are Sunni Muslim. Many of the people who have come to the US now from the southeastern part of the country are Pashtun, and they speak the language called Pashto. The next in population size is the Dari speaking group, and that could be called Tajik or Persian or Farsi, and they too live throughout Afghanistan, and they are mostly Sunni Muslim. And then in that central area, kind of purpley area, you see Hazara language, and that's about 9% of the population. They speak a dialect of Persian or Dari, and they are the most marginalized group politically and socially. They've been persecuted by Pashtun governments, by warlords, and most recently under the Taliban with massive genocide incidents. Many fled to Iran during the past 40 years, and quite a few migrated to Pakistan at the turn of the 20th century, and they're now considered Pakistanis. Of course, in the north, there are the Turkic languages, and the area where I worked on languages all the way in the east in Jalalabad region, yet another whole group of languages. The point here is that over the years, many of these rival groups have competed over land and resources and power, and it's contributed to cycles of conflict and dissidence, and loyalty tends to be to kin, ethnicity, and tribe. And it's also the case that these prejudices and rivalries between families, tribes, and ethnicities are not left behind in Afghanistan. They bring them with them to the diaspora. Just a quick note here that there is an Afghan and an Afghani, and the currency is known as Afghani, and the nationality is known as Afghan. Or some people because Afghan is very closely associated with Pashtun, some people prefer to be called Afghanistani, but it's kind of a fine point. Afghan society is steeped in Islam, and its central organizing principle is prominent in most Afghans' lives. The one thing that's common to all Afghans is their commitment to Islam as both a belief system and as a social program. The idea is that the unity of belief is linked to collective well-being, resulting in social order. So Islam brings a strong sense of morality. Sunni Muslims make up 90% of the population. Shia Muslims are only 10%, but both Sunni and Shia follow the religious texts of the Quran and the Hadith, which is the words and actions of the Prophet. And they share their commitment to the 5 pillars of Islam, which are prayer, charity, the fasting for the month of Ramadan, the Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca, and the declaration of faith known as the Shahada. The virgin birth of Jesus is upheld in Islam, and Jesus is considered the penultimate prophet. He's mentioned throughout the Quran, as is Mary or Maryam, and is greatly revered. Islam pervades all aspects of life. The sayings and the anecdotes about the prophet are told often, and people pray multiple times a day, or they choose not to. Clothing is Islamically informed. It's meant to be modest and loose-fitting in general. Islam informs what is halal, that which is permissible, from marriage partners to foods, and what is haram, which is that which is not permissible, such as foods like pork or alcohol. And many other aspects, social interactions and life cycle rituals are dictated by Islam. So we have heard that Afghans are particularly concerned that the doctors here or the medical practitioners do not have their best interests in mind because the Afghans are Muslims and they're refugees, and they're not sure that non-Muslims would have their best interest. They're also quite concerned that there might be some non-permissible ingredient in medicine. And in fact, many people get their medicines brought from Afghanistan or sent from Pakistan or India, where regulations are much weaker, because they trust those medications, the medications they're familiar with, and not the medications available here. I know it's a generalization. Many people are self-prescribed pain medication and have become dependent on them, although they would not see this as an addiction. And some are concerned that hospital food is not halal and they'll bring their own food to the hospital. So those are some of their concerns. The Islamic calendar is lunar, and there's also a solar calendar in Afghanistan. The dates for Islamic holidays do not line up with the Gregorian calendar. So this year, Ramadan began at the beginning of April and ended at the beginning of May. Ramadan is a month of spiritual reflection and fasting from sunup to sundown. So families often get up before sunrise, have a meal together, and then don't take water or food until the evening break fast, which is called iftar. Since fasting is so important at this time, people might avoid taking medication and refuse medical tests so as not to break the fast. And pregnant women will fast to the detriment of their health. Islam does not actually permit people who are physically compromised to fast, but nevertheless, this is a common social practice, and women would be ashamed if people found out they were not fasting, even pregnant. The month of Ramadan ends with Eid, and it's the festival of the breaking of the fast, and it's appropriate to give gift baskets and sweets and candies and say Eid Mubarak. Of course, there are other holidays, but since these were the most recent ones, I wasn't going to go into all of them. Birthdays, celebrations are not customary among the Afghans. And in fact, till recently, and still in many cases, births are not recorded officially. And Afghans often estimate their age and they choose their own birthdays. Other core concepts that are organizing principles in Afghan society include honor, family, and gender roles. Afghan communities, the village and the rural regions, tend to be self-governing. There has never been much reach of the government into the rural regions, and the government is seen as corrupt, unreliable, unavailable, and rapacious. So suspicion runs high of government representation and authorities. Therefore, Afghans prefer to avoid authorities and manage their affairs themselves. This often extends to medical personnel and Western medicine structures and practices. Developing trust and positive relationships to government representatives and all kinds of figures of authority will take time. There are numerous structural differences between the way medicine is practiced in Afghanistan and here. For example, there's practically no preventative care in Afghanistan. So medicine is all problem-oriented. If you're in pain or distress, you go to the doctor or a clinic. You're seen without an appointment and usually given medicine and at least vitamins, and records are not kept. Much social behavior is influenced by Afghans' awareness of their personal honor. Honor refers to a person's reputation, their prestige, or their value, and it is how they are perceived by their community. A person's reputation precedes them in all things. So I kind of like to think of it as a wheelbarrow. It can tip over very easily. It's not very stable. And generations of your family might be riding up front, symbolically in this wheelbarrow with their honor, their wealth, their piety, their humility. And so an individual who goes out into the world is responsible for their predecessors and their predecessors' honor as they go out into the world, and actually for whoever follows them. So it's quite a burden. So how one conducts themselves is very carefully circumscribed. So in this way, an individual embodies more than just themselves when they put their reputation on the line. So they're doing that for their current, their previous, their future family members. And most Afghans consider a person's behavior to be reflective of their family. Thus, when a person's behavior is perceived as dishonorable, the family shares the shame. If this occurs in the wider sphere, in school, say, or in a workplace, then the dishonor may implicate their ethnic group or their tribe or even their religious sect. So preservation of honor and community opinion is often at the forefront of people's minds, and this cannot be overstated. So it influences people to behave conservatively in accordance with social expectations and to avoid drawing attention to themselves or risking doing anything that might be perceived as dishonorable. It puts a great deal of pressure on people, especially youth growing up here, to maintain strict social boundaries. The senior male member of a family is responsible to protect the honor and well-being of the family, particularly as it concerns the behavior of women around dress, social interactions, education, work, and public presence. It can be seen as a loss of honor to the father or the brother or the husband if a woman does not comply with these expectations. This can be a source of mental distress for both parties, and it can is often the source of violence, domestic violence, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. With respect to the family, the core notion of public versus private is at play. So private is both physical and social. Family matters are part of that private sphere. So an Afghan home is like a fortress surrounded by high mud brick walls. The social space faces the inner courtyard. The outer walls have no windows. 3 or 4 generations could be sharing this space. A nuclear family might have only 1 or 2 rooms to themselves, and families tend to sleep together in one room. There's precious little sense of privacy or private space in an Afghan household. By the same token, social isolation is considered severe punishment, and the notion of time out could be considered cruel by some. With respect to privacy and modesty, women often refuse to be seen by a male medical practitioner, and there aren't always female practitioners available, but they may refuse tests and x-rays because of their concerns about privacy and modesty. And in fact, in rural Afghanistan, where there are basically no female doctors, it's typical for the man, the husband, for example, to go to the doctor and on behalf of the woman, describe her complaints and come back with medication. In urban areas, space is limited and people live in small compounds or apartment blocks, which there are many of apartment blocks as well. And though people in urban settings have access to more medical options, there's still a problem-oriented approach. There's no prevention. As I said, people are used to being seen immediately at a clinic. They walk in, they expect medicine right away for every complaint. And a doctor that does not prescribe is not a good doctor and must not know what they're doing. And we hear this over and over again. So here, Afghans tend to use the ER that way, like a walk-in clinic, for everything from dental pain to abdominal distress. They often leave without discharge papers and instructions. They often reject Iranian Persian or Pakistani Pashto interpreters, even if that's all the hospital has, because they don't think that they can explain well enough their problem. Women's sphere is the home. And women are in charge of all the domestic chores and much of what goes on inside the home. In addition to the cooking and the cleaning and the raising of the children and the preparing food, which families are quite large, so it takes a lot of work, childcare is kind of passed down in line to the older children. Certainly matriarchs exercise decision-making powers, especially over daughters and daughters-in-law. So depending on the household dynamics, it could be more or less extensive. And they can, weigh in on marriage arrangements, household spending, education of daughters, and more. And I should add here too, whether they let someone go to the doctor or not. A woman go to the doctor might be in the hands of the oldest of the mother-in-law who rules the roost or the oldest sister-in-law, whoever. It's not even necessarily a husband's choice as to whether he takes his wife to the doctor. Of course, people are not in multi-generational households here as much, but that is definitely a factor. I love to mention laundry. Laundry is done by hand, and women prefer to do it themselves at home. It's a point of privacy and of pride to do their family's laundry and the laundry of their guests. So when people come visit your house, they usually have one change of clothes, and the laundry is done right then and there by the women. Laundromats are not that welcome. People don't like it. Afghans don't typically change their clothes very often, and they don't wear pajamas to go to sleep because personal hygiene comes at a high cost in Afghanistan, where water is scarce and heating it requires precious fuel. And in some rural areas, pregnant women believe it is bad for the baby if they wash up, and they might go a very long time without washing up because of that. So personal hygiene and the hygiene of the children is not seen as important. It's not a factor, even though it's easier here. It's what people are accustomed to. So as you can see, conditions differ greatly in urban settings, and the evacuees here come from both urban and rural backgrounds. Although much of the housework still falls on girls, there is less manual labor, and girls have more opportunities to attend school, those in urban settings. The men's role is chiefly outside the house in the public sphere. They are responsible for the family's economic well-being. Women may earn income through home-based work, such as embroidery, tailoring, and fruit preparation, particularly in the countryside. And in urban areas, women have more opportunities to work outside the home, particularly educated women. And there are many households where women earn income to support their families. So family structure is traditional and patriarchal, and most of the decisions are taken by the father, the husband, or the oldest son even. Even though much of this is in flux, and the gender roles or responsibilities have changed over the course of the last 20 years, there's more choice among the urban and educated, but much in the countryside has not changed. And many of the rural Afghans I know who've emigrated to the US or to the European diaspora follow this pattern. In many households, women are still expected to stay home, and it may take quite a few years before they resettle, before they can learn to drive or learn the local language or perhaps get a job. Many women suffer from the pressures of managing a large household with the lack of mobility and few choices in life. So in some ways, the diaspora could be more isolating because the men are even more concerned about letting the women go out here. And they may even restrict their mobility even more than before. In some ways, women have improved access. They go to language classes and things like that, but they may not always have enough family support to make some of those changes. Pastimes in Afghanistan are very social, such as visiting family and friends, where stories and gossip are shared, and gossip is a national sport. And also, when you wonder, where did they get this information? Information travels really fast among Afghans. And so it doesn't take a lot of literacy to know what's going on or what you've heard very quickly. So tea and dried fruit would be the minimal kind of gesture of hospitality. And Afghans, really do like their sweets. Offering tea is proper etiquette. If you're offered tea, you should never refuse it. You don't have to drink it if you don't want to, but it would be insulting to refuse it. Tea is never really about the tea so much as a gesture of friendship, respect, and hospitality. There's a considerable range of attitudes among Afghans towards education. In rural areas, there's widespread reserve about education, especially for girls, and education is limited and low by comparison to the US and many other places. Lack of literacy is commonplace, and it's not shameful. So lack of literacy makes it especially hard to keep track of the many documents, appointments, test results that are the basis of our society. And students with learning issues in Afghanistan, they would just stop going to school. School is not mandatory there. But the challenges for these children are often swept under the rug, and the general idea being that they will not do anything with their lives. It's not going to change, so just let them be. So there's no notion of treatment for better outcomes. Of course, the schools in Afghanistan are gender segregated, and Afghan parents are not typically involved in their children's education. They send them to school, and whatever happens there is outside the home, so it's not the mother's responsibility, and it's the teacher's responsibility. And this is a lot of adjustment here. After school activities, sports, and sleepovers are not likely for many kids, especially for girls, especially teenage girls who may already be engaged, and dating is forbidden. So of course, this will impact their school performance in ways that they may not imagine, and the lack of socialization with non-Afghans makes learning English that much harder. Multiple family members participate in the raising of children, and so in Afghanistan, if a child is sick, anyone might take them to the doctor, not a legal guardian or even a designated person or a relative. So those things that we have here about who's allowed to bring someone, or guardianship, is hard for them to understand. Here, they typically send their children to the doctor with someone who could translate, may not even be a relative. Of course, parents don't keep track of their kids' dates of birth or their surgeries or immunizations, their previous health history. They don't even know their own medical history, much less their children's. And if records are kept, they're often crumpled or torn or scribbled on. They don't protect them and understand how important they are. As I said earlier, I think that Afghan clinics in Afghanistan do not keep records. Arranging marriages, celebrations of engagement, entertaining guests are hugely important to Afghans. In some cases, parents engage their babies to each other to solidify bonds. In other cases, individuals find their own mates in what are known as love marriages. First cousin marriage is very common. And marriages can be quite fraught. There's numerous circumstances under which a girl is married to someone she does not wish to be married to. She may be decades younger than her husband, or a second or third wife. She may have been married off to settle a family debt or dispute. She may be in an abusive relationship, and domestic violence is widespread. In Afghanistan, where divorce is taboo, women sometimes attempt to escape to a shelter. Women quickly learn here that they have rights and their options, which often causes more friction in a household. Socialization outside the immediate family tends to be gender segregated. So men socialize with men and women with women, and it doesn't apply across the board. Many urban and educated may socialize publicly in formal mixed settings, but generally not. So men will hold men's hands, and it's a sign of friendship, and women are affectionate with women. But as far as we're concerned, there should be no cross-gender contact. And if a man does not put his hand out to shake a woman's hand, it's considered a sign of respect, not of disrespect. And the same thing with eye contact. You might find someone averting their eyes. It's not disrespectful, it's meant to be respectful. It's hard to read it that way though. So in general, keeping very careful distance, and if you have to be alone with somebody, best not to close the door, because questions will be asked as to what happened inside. In general, conservative Afghan society, women and girls have been very limited. Women are meant not to be seen outside the family. And so Afghan women are typically accompanied by a mahram, a male escort. And that is why women seeking medical treatment do not come alone. Women have fought hard to gain legitimacy and authority in public decision-making in parts of Afghanistan, yet they may still be obedient to their fathers, their brothers, and their husbands. And women and girls in school will often, or in a meeting, a gathering or something, they may not speak before men do. And in fact, they may not speak at all in front of men. If you want to hear what women have to say, just gather the women by themselves. So this brings us to communication in general. And a statement I heard recently that I think characterizes the difference between Afghan communication and our style of communication is that some things need to be said and some things need to be understood. And our US style of communication is very explicit. Things need to be said. We rely a whole lot less on implication. Our style is very direct. We don't expect there to be a whole context that we understand. By contrast, Afghanistan is a high context society. Meaning is embedded in sociocultural context, and much of the communication is implicit. It's all about what is understood, not so much about what is said. Very indirect communication style. People use analogies, they use stories, they use implication. And conspiracy theories run wild in this style of communication. So it connects with notions of honor because Afghan communication is at all costs mutually preserving of dignity and honor, and people avoid direct criticism. Admitting you don't have the right answer could be a loss of face, could be a loss of honor. So people will not ask directly sometimes. And people have a hard time asking for assistance because it looks like a sign of weakness. So if you ask someone if they understand the medical directions that you've given them, they will say yes, because that's the right thing to say. And you wouldn't want to say you didn't understand, but often people don't follow medical or health advice or finish medication or even make follow-up visits. There's an expression someone once said to me, which is that Americans have watches and Afghans have time. And it partly has to do with the different structures of our societies. We are highly commodified and monetized, and punctuality really matters, but it's not a shared notion in Afghanistan, and it's a big challenge for people here. Time is viewed more flexibly. So making appointments, coming early or on time is not important. Many think that if they come around that time, they can be seen. They don't understand that somebody else has the next time slot and might get angry if they have to reschedule. So I wanted to show you a little bit more about domestic life. Afghans like to eat fresh food. In the countryside, there is no refrigeration, so food is prepared fresh every day. People tend to sit on the ground around a tablecloth and eat, and hospitality is very important. But nutrition is not a thing, so attention is not given to it. A lot of sweets are consumed, and cooking is done in large quantities. So if somebody needs to eat salt-free, they may not be able to do that in their families. Smaller families do better with children, with attention to children. So before we move into more specifically medical things, I wanted to summarize that family is paramount, that protecting dignity and respect are what's foremost in people's minds, that gender roles are very clearly defined between men and women, and the rules of relations, everybody knows them. Personal honor is what people are protecting a great deal, that hospitality, politeness, and modesty are seen as very important, that communication styles are indirect and protective of the listener and the speaker's dignity, that time orientation is, there tends to be more concern about what happened, less about punctuality or timeliness, and deadlines just aren't that important. And of course, to remember that 45 years of war, broken promises, displacement, weak government really have taken a toll on people's lives. And it's part of everyone's experience. Now, preventative medical care, dental care, eye care, exercise, heart-healthy eating, mindfulness, attention to mental health and stress, these are all new ideas that will take time. Dental problems, for example, are rampant. Tooth infections, there is really no dental care. Typically, a tooth is rotten, it gets pulled out in Afghanistan. So people don't understand why they have to live with pain when they should have it just taken care of very quickly. So our system of PCPs and testing and specialists is unfamiliar, and it doesn't make sense to them. Often they conclude that doctors here are not very good and do not know anything, because all of this testing means that they don't actually know what's going on. Whereas in Afghanistan, you'll always get some medicine and some vitamins. So they don't think that our doctors here are very knowledgeable. People are, of course, afraid of testing and afraid of surgery, particularly anesthesia. There's a lot of concern as to what these non-Muslims will do to them when they're unconscious. So people will hide illness because of this. One person expressed to me that he was sure that cancer entered the body by way of surgery, because how else could it get in there? And naturally, they have a hard time getting their concerns understood, especially with no record keeping and no medical histories. So just a few concerns. Pregnancy and related issues are the primary concerns for women, right? So women might have hormonal imbalances or vitamin deficiencies or anemia, but often that doesn't get addressed if the provider is dismissive of their symptoms. It may seem easy for practitioners to tell them to stop having babies, but they won't listen to that. And doctors need to figure out, or medical practitioners, ways to mitigate the negative effects of more pregnancies, even if the best course of action is to stop getting pregnant. I think it would, practitioners can demonstrate concern for women's health and that of their children. And just, relationships have to be built over time. Some women will flatly refuse to do what the provider suggests. And in such cases, at least the provider may have the chance to offer alternative options, but most will politely say yes and not comply. And that's a trickier situation. Most women can't follow doctor's instructions for aftercare, especially for tests or a heart monitor, because their household obligations make it, and all the children make it hard for them to attend to these things. In Afghanistan, people are often given just a few days of medicine, like not a 10-day course, rarely, a 10-day course or a 20-day regimen. So they're only expected to take it for 3 or 4 days. And so more medicine, longer days means they're probably not very good medicine. So medical practitioners may perceive that women are disinterested or indifferent to being pregnant because they've had many children already. And some may have undiagnosed postpartum depression that they themselves don't recognize. Afghan doctors have reported to us that that even women who are uninterested or unhappy when they find out they're pregnant will not express their unhappiness because it's God's will. And there's a sense of shame as an expression of modesty in being pregnant. For example, families will expect to be congratulated for the announcement of a pregnancy, but when you actually talk to the mother about the growth of the fetus and the progression of the pregnancy, she will shy away from that topic. So they do typically tell their relatives if the wife is pregnant, but they don't want to go any further into conversation about it. And I've observed that you hardly see women even touching their bellies in the way that women do here. There is an expectation that women, especially in the rural areas, will be pregnant a lot of the time. And if she isn't, there will be intense gossip about why she is not. Is she using family planning? Is there a physical problem? Will her husband take a second or third wife if she doesn't reproduce? So there are numerous negative practices that Afghan women, especially in the countryside, do, such as starving themselves in pregnancy to reduce the size of the baby for easier delivery. I'm not saying this is across the board, but in some areas I've observed this and I've heard people talk about it. Not, fasting during Ramadan, not washing up, and afraid to take vitamins. They think that might harm the baby. So they would sooner follow the advice of an elderly woman in their village or in their family than a doctor or a practitioner. This data comes from UNICEF, and so this is just where they're coming from, right? So coverage of prenatal care by a doctor, nurse, or midwife is very low. 48% of women receive prenatal care at least once by a skilled health personnel during their pregnancy. Overall, prenatal care is inconsistent and applied only in a minority of cases. Among women who've given birth to a child during the 2 years preceding, only 12% had prenatal care visits where their blood pressure was measured, the urine or blood tested, and doctors assist with delivery 20% of the births, or nurses and midwives with 16% of the births, and or auxiliary midwives, so less trained midwives with a smaller percentage. But more than 60% were delivered with the assistance of non-skilled personnel. Almost 33% of births in Afghanistan are delivered in a health facility. More than half occur at home. And women in urban areas are more than twice as likely to deliver in a health facility than in the rural area. And as you can see, the C-section rate is very low. And I know from my own experience in Afghanistan, women tend to deliver their own babies, actually. since few women have access to prenatal care in Afghanistan, most will experience it here for the first time, especially on the military bases where they were. And the norm is to have a natural and unassisted labor. And so, as I mentioned, C-section is not typical. Even the epidural is not common in Afghanistan, and unsanitary conditions in most hospitals. Women have traumatic births quite a bit. And compared to that, giving birth in the US is seen as really easy, and they perceive the epidural to be an easy way to have a pain-free labor. There's no shame in having a C-section, but women may have an aversion to it as it is surgery, and the recovery time, of course, is longer. And it may be difficult for them to reassume their household responsibilities after the baby is born, which they are expected to do quite quickly. Contraceptive usage is pretty low. So despite the risks of early childbearing to mother and child, 10% of women in Afghanistan aged 15 to 19 have already had a birth, and 4% are pregnant with their first child. Therefore, 14% have begun childbearing. Alarmingly, 2% have had a live birth before the age of 15. 1 in 4 women aged 20 to 24 have already had a live birth before reaching the age of 18. And there's a strong correlation between early childbearing and mothers' educational levels. So women, as you can see, with higher education levels are having children a little bit later. So using contraception more. So contraception is extremely low, with most 80% not using it. And those women who do, the most popular method is injectable, followed by the pill. The percentage of women who are using contraception is higher, as you can see by the education level. Abortion is not an accepted practice. Women often ask about birth control in safe and private settings, but men are often opposed to it. Many consider babies to be gifts from God and birth control non-Islamic. Men don't understand the toll that multiple pregnancies take on women's well-being, and this subject needs to be handled delicately and with husband and wife. Some patients are open to family planning and may even have tried it in Afghanistan. Some have had arm implants, but often they'll not be able to stand the symptoms, and they take it out themselves and complain about it. Barrier methods would not work because compliance can be quite a problem, and Afghans tend to see having children as a good thing, and some women might even have children just to have an extra one, another one, even if they have quite a few, to have one in the US as well. And having sons is status. So if you don't have sons, you just keep trying for them. And women are valued by the number of sons they produce, and Afghan families could be 6 to 10 children, especially for rural ones. Fathers take great pride in having these large families and announce to everyone that they have a dozen children. Babies are typically swaddled like this for most of their first year. Coal is rubbed, it's called surma. It's can't begin to say what it is rubbed into their eyes as soon as they're born, and they say it's good for them. There are numerous superstitious practices around infants. So this tight swaddling, they think it helps them grow straighter, but doctors here are quite concerned because they're using this sash to swaddle them, and they're afraid they might choke. Some babies in some areas, they are not actually given colostrum. They're not nursing from the time they're born, but actually a day or two later. So they'll give them gripe water or fennel water or something like that. And they're covered with amulets and talismans. So as you can see, breastfeeding is very popular, and people do it for a long time. So 80%, 88% are continue to breastfeed at 1 year. And do I have that in these stats or not? I hope they've lined up. Bottle feeding, not so popular. Even at 2 years, children are breastfed, a lot of them. But only 54% are breastfed within the first day or so when they're born, and most of them start within a couple of days. This really depends on the region. 92% of Afghan women feel that their husbands have a right to hit or beat them for at least one of a variety of reasons. And it's an alarming statistic. So women who approve of their husband's violence in most cases agree and justify violence in instances where women neglect the child, or when they demonstrate their autonomy, such as going out without telling their husbands, or if they argue with their husbands. Disagree with them. Almost 2/3 of women accept their husband's violence for the reason of wearing inappropriate clothing. Almost half of women believe that their husbands have a right to hit or beat them if they refuse to have sex with them, or if they burn the food. It's a big thing, burning food. Acceptance is more widespread among those women living in the poorest households who are less educated, and also among women than in educated households. So of course, the universal signs of domestic abuse are well known. And even if these women are being domestically abused, most will never speak up because they feel that if their husbands were to go to prison, or if they were to be separated, the struggle of providing for their kids and being independent in the US is something they cannot handle. So in their minds, it's better to stay with a known evil than to be alone in an unknown environment. And in any case, as the report indicates, 90% believe that their husband has the right to hit or beat them if they've done something wrong. They don't consider it abuse. They consider it the right of the husband. Policies and trust. Because medical care is so different here from what Afghans are accustomed to, it is a challenge for medical providers to examine to explain the differences in policies, especially when it comes to prescribing less medication than back in Afghanistan. And it may help to explain that medicine is regulated more strictly than in Afghanistan. We think that they will understand that it's different here than there. They already know that, and that they have no choice but to accept that they will not be given the level of relief that they found back home, especially in pain management. Also, they don't understand about addiction to opioids and about building tolerance. So this is something that they may need pointed out and help to understand, and pointing out the side effects of taking multiple medications. Gaining trust is a serious problem. We suggest that providers be open and honest, using an interpreter to explain that they only want to help. And although it may take trial and error to find the source of the problem, that they should be patient. And that's counter to the way that they've seen medicine before, but the procedure of pathology can be explained, and how diseases and illnesses are treated at the root cause instead of given strong medication to mask symptoms. And they may come to understand that when they stop taking medication, the pain will return anyways. So in general, trust is something that can be built over time. And in Afghan communities, it's really important to find the influencers, the elder community members, to convey a message through them. And even in a family, there's usually an individual who may be more educated or elder or has been here longer that can be trusted, and that they can use them to bridge the gap. I'm going to stop here because we're just about out of time. If you have any questions, but we'll take it up next time. I hope that I've touched on some issues that were meaningful.
Thank you so much, Rachel. This is very, very, very informative. We have like 5 minutes for questions, and we also have an entire hour for next week. So if you have a quick question, I think Rachel and Zala can take one or two.
Did Zala come and I missed it? Welcome.
And then I will invite everyone for the Q&A next week. So the floor is open to everyone. Or we can leave 4 minutes early.
Sometimes it takes a while for people to decide.
Mm-hmm.
I could ask a question. Can you hear me? Just about children and play, or expectations of children in a social setting, and just if you could speak to that playing for children.
So usually I'll start, and then Zala, I know you're here somewhere, so you can jump in, because this question came up a little bit last time when we were talking about children in social settings, and sometimes the children are allowed to run a little more freely in Afghanistan, to roam and to have to be supervised a whole lot less. Children play like children play, but they might be less supervised, and they might be more physically rough with each other and with some of the friends that they encounter here than parents are used to, and that could create some friction. Zala, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was 10 minutes late. Yeah, just to add to that, that in Afghanistan, children, when they go to school, it's just for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So it's not like US to go till like 4:30 p.m. So in rural areas, which is 75 to 80% of Afghanistan, I would say children are outside home like all the time, you know, except that 2 hours that they're in school, and or they come just for lunch or dinner until like evening time. So they're outside their homes and they just play without any like one watching them or like all of that. Even in cities like or urban settings, it's still like children are going play in the streets and or park nearby park without their parents or anybody watching them. And that's happening in US as well, at least with some families who came recently in California. I witnessed when I was there for a month with a relative. And I could see that all these Afghan families, they would go to the park and their mom would just sit and have tea and chat, and the kids were like just playing, or even they play in parking lot, you know, and yeah, I mean, everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if there was another part of your question about what games they play, or what, or just sort of the social interaction of the playing.
Yeah, just mostly about the social interactions. Some of us on the call work with families, you know, in a family center play group, kind of parent-child play group situation, and have had Afghan families, and just wonder what expectations or cultural background they're bringing.
Yeah, I don't know if we've answered it, but parenting, the way that we see parenting is not such a thing, you know? Yeah.
I have a quick question. So I'm the coordinator in the Berkshires for JFS, and a lot of the volunteers say, Gabriella, we need some like parenting classes around nutrition and like especially the dental hygiene. And I'm just wondering if I facilitated a nutritionist or a children's specialist who is focusing on, you know, dental hygiene and that kind of thing, is that considered offensive, or are they open to that kind of information? Yeah.
Yeah, great. It's a great question. And if you have a way of doing that, not just in one session, but maybe as a part of their English classes or ongoing, I don't know, Zala, I mean, we've talked about that before, about teaching people about those sorts of things. So what do you think, Zala?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it won't be like, I don't see any reason for it to be offensive or they would mind any orientation or anything, both the families or the kids. I mean, and it's very needed as well, because unfortunately in Afghanistan, the other issue is also that there has been no rule of law, or like there's no compliance. So they say, yeah, I mean, even if you tell a kid or even an adult that if you don't do this, this would be the consequence, they don't believe you easily. Like they don't trust unless it happens to them. And we don't want that. We want to prevent that. For example, if you say that, okay, don't play in the parking lot because if you hit a car or somebody, then the police will come. They won't listen, you know, until it happens to them. And same with, of course, other issues like health related. So not only one orientation, I would say several, and giving examples, real life examples of what has happened to other Afghan or non-Afghan families, that would really help them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We're right at 5. I know there's a lot more questions, and I think that's an important topic, and Rachel and Zala, you covered a lot of questions that come up all the time. But I think it's the time to stop and we can think about this information and come back next week, regather and bring back any questions you may have. And invite anyone who's interested in the subject, doctors or providers. They can come in and ask these questions. I'm sure Rachel and Zala can give us a lot of very helpful information. So thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you so much, Zala, and everyone who attended. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you all.
We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.